but because as a field, as a set of disciplines, mental health professionals have been letting people down, and they've been causing more suffering than they have alleviated. Now, please, I always say this, and people walk away not hearing it. Please don't leave here saying, Paula Caplan says nobody should ever see a therapist and there's not a good one, because I don't believe in that. But what I'm going to say is to be seen in the context of people being able to do what they want to get the kind of help that really is useful to them, and to be fully informed and not be harmed in trying to get help. And let me say a couple of things. I'm going to speak mostly about psychiatric diagnosis, but let me say a couple of things about clinicians, what clinicians can do in general. There are two criteria that I think should always be met whenever anyone, a clinician or a friend or a pastoral counselor or whatever, says, I see you're suffering and here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest X for you. Now, the first criterion that should be met is that if I say I'm recommending X for you, then I'm going to take responsibility for telling you everything I could find out about the potential benefits of X and the potential kinds of harm. And if what I'm recommending is a psychiatric drug, then I need to say to you, however, try though I did to get all the available information about this drug, lawsuits have shown that psychiatric drug makers, big pharma, purposely, knowingly minimize reporting of adverse effects. And they call them side effects, which I hope nobody will ever say again. These are not side effects, they're effects, or they're negative effects. Side effects makes it seem like, oh yeah, but that's not a big deal. If it happens to you, there's nothing side about it. So that's the first criterion. If I'm recommending X, I have to say, here's everything I could find out about the potential benefits and the potential kinds of harm to you. And then the second criterion, and almost nobody ever does that, by the way. The second criterion I need to meet is I need to say to you, well, although I'm recommending that you do X, I am also going to tell you about the whole range of kinds of things that at least some people who are experiencing what you are, or who've been through what you've been through, have found to be helpful. And I'm going to include in there not just the traditional medicalizing ones, but more importantly, the kinds that don't involve calling you mentally ill in order to give you access to whatever this approach, this kind of help would be. So that can range from having a service animal to doing mindfulness or meditation or yoga or other kinds of physical exercise, to engagement in the arts or in community action and volunteer work, to political action, to legal action, to education, to having somebody just listen to you, to having a friend, to having a safe place to stay, to having meaning in your life. All of those things don't require a label of psychiatric disorder, and they have few or no risks, and they have all been proven to help. Now, those are the two criteria that should always be met, and they almost never are. And instead, what happens increasingly, I've used the term psychiatrizing. We live in an increasingly psychiatrized world. And what I mean by that is that absolutely every kind of feeling, except for joy, is considered a mental illness. Every pattern of behavior can be classified as a mental illness. And that's very dangerous. So I called this talk the first cause of everything bad in the mental health system for this reason, that if they don't diagnose you, they can't treat you, for better or for worse. But once they've diagnosed you, once they have given you even what might seem to be the most safe, minimal, innocuous sounding label, like adjustment disorder, once you have that label, they can do just about anything to you in the name of treatment. And if it doesn't help you, You don't get your money back. Well, the National Health Service doesn't get its money back. But if they harm you, they cannot be held responsible. Why? Because if they are following what's considered the standard of care, then nothing can happen to them. In the UK, as in the US and Canada and everywhere that psychiatric diagnosis is used, there is no regulation. There is absolutely no oversight whatsoever. Now, in the European Union, in the US, we have entities that are supposed to oversee drugs. They don't always do such a great job, but at least they exist. At least there are some rules that are supposed to be followed. Think about this, there's absolutely no regulation of psychiatric diagnosis. Psychiatric diagnosis is destroying people's lives in a myriad of ways, and nobody is regulating it. Now, in 1985, I was teaching graduate students at the University of Toronto, and I was teaching the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders as an advocate, because I believed the American Psychiatric Association's advertising. That's the publisher of it, as you probably know. I believe their advertising. And I used to say to my students, isn't it wonderful? These experts have read through all of the research about human suffering, and they've looked at what's scientific and what's not good science. And after culling through all that, they've put together this compendium that shows us scientifically how to reduce human suffering. Now, what could be better than that? And then I'd written a book called The Myth of Women's Masochism, which I had written because I was so tired of hearing people say, if he abuses her and she stays with him, it must be because she enjoys it. And just then, DSM-3R was going to be prepared, and some new categories of psychiatric disorder were suggested, and they were going to be particularly dangerous to women. Now, because of limited time today, I'm not going to go into any of the details of that, but I will say that it's all in this book I wrote called They Say You're Crazy, How the World's Most Powerful Psychiatrists Decide Who's Normal. Because what happened was, I joined with a group of feminist psychologists and psychiatrists to object to these new proposals that were going to be dangerous to women. And I went to a meeting with some of the DSM head honchos, and I thought I'd say my piece, and then they would tell me what I failed to understand, because I've never been afraid of being wrong and being correct. And I thought, well, these are the big guns, you know, these are the experts. I read their work in graduate school. There's probably something I'm not getting about this, and they'll just teach me, so that'll be fine. Well, instead, I was absolutely stunned by how they ignored good science if it didn't fit with what they wanted, or they distorted it, or they lied about it. And when I wrote They Say You're Crazy, I used the word lie. You know about libel lawsuits? I thought, well, they'll probably try to sue me, but I've got all this documentation. They've never even tried to sue me because they know that it's true. So I saw that they took junk science and then they distorted that and presented it as though it supported whatever they wanted to do anyway, whatever categories they wanted to put in the DSM. Oh, here's the science to support it. And whatever categories they wanted to keep out, oh, here's the science to support that. They almost never keep anything out, of course. So I learned that what they were doing was not science. And then as I started to, I served on 2 of the committees to write the next edition, DSM-4. Their task force for DSM-4 was headed by Dr. Alan Francis. And I was asked by Dr. Francis, I called him to say, you know, I was one of the people who opposed some of these new diagnoses that went into DSM-3R anyway. And I wanted to offer to work with you. My graduate students and I are going to be reviewing the research about these different categories as it comes out, and let's not, be duplicating each other's work. And he said, well, I have a better idea. Why don't you join 2 of our committees? And I said to him, well, okay, but I think I should tell you, if I'm not comfortable with what is happening, I'll resign, and I will feel free to speak publicly about what I've learned. And he said, I'm sure you will. Well, that's what happened. I stayed on those 2 committees for 2 years. In the book, I write a whole chapter about the dozens of gatekeeping techniques, of ways that they find to put in the manual what they want and to keep out what they don't want in it. And so when I learned how dishonest was their work, how they made false claims that it's scientifically based, and let me just say something about that. It's one thing to say, oh, well, there's scientific research to show that painting walls green makes people happier than painting them gray. But when you're talking about claiming that there is science behind attempts to categorize people based on the nature of their suffering, their emotions, and their behavior, and when it's destroying their lives, those kinds of lies are absolutely unconscionable. They have absolutely no right to claim that there's science behind what they do. Because then what happens? People everywhere that psychiatric diagnosis is used, they're suffering, increasingly. They're told, go see a therapist. Somebody close to you died, you're still grieving, and it's been 6 weeks. Don't you think you should go see somebody, meaning a professional, and get a little something to take the edge off? So there's no such thing as problems in living. Everything is a psychiatric disorder. And so when you're suffering and people say, well, I don't think I'm qualified to listen to you talk about how you felt since your loved one died, because I'm not a therapist. That's the increasing psychiatrizing of the society. Then you go to a therapist. And if they say you have major depressive disorder, you have no reason to think to question them about, well, exactly what is that? Is that a real thing? Is it a real entity? Is there scientific research? Why are you not just saying I'm grieving because I lost a loved one? So you think, oh, I have this thing, and here's this expert who, based on the science, is telling me what I have, and who, therefore, by virtue of their expertise, presumably knows what's going to help me feel better. So you have no way to even know what questions to ask, and that's very dangerous. So after 2 years of being on those 2 committees and learning not only did they lie, but that when I would increasingly hear from people who knew I was on these committees and I was starting to write and speak about these topics, I would hear increasingly from people who'd been harmed because of being given a psychiatric label. And I would tell the DSM people about this. And I would say, look, what you're doing isn't scientific and it's hurting people. And something needs to be done. You need to be more honest. If you want to make up categories and apply them, at least say, we made these up. We voted. The committee, the majority of our committee or a task force voted that this is now a category. At least be honest about the lack of science and do something to prevent or reduce the harm that you're causing with these labels. And when people have been harmed, provide some way for them to get redress. Now, you may know that the DSM-4, the edition previous to the current one, brought in over $100 million of profits for the American Psychiatric Association. Psychiatric diagnosis is big business. They use not 1 cent of that money to do any of those things that I just named. So on moral, ethical, and professional grounds, I resigned from the DSM-4 task force, and I wrote They Say You're Crazy because I thought the public has a right to know what is going on behind those closed doors. And I'm the only person who's ever been on a DSM task force who saw how it all works from the inside, how they think up categories and decide what goes in and doesn't, and then who resigned and spoke publicly about it. There are a lot of other good books about problems with psychiatric diagnosis, and they're on a website that I'm going to give you later on. You can go there and find some of these wonderful works. But I resigned, and then I started thinking, you know, if you imagine the realm of psychiatric diagnosis, the whole enterprise, if you imagine it as a sphere, well, the DSM people tell you that sphere is filled with solid science, but we know it isn't. So if you take out all of that, it leaves a vacuum. And excuse me, when there's a vacuum, what happens? Nature abhors a vacuum. So when there's a void of objectivity, then every kind of bias, every kind of subjectivity rushes in to fill that vacuum. So after They Say You're Crazy came out, a few years later, the Association for Women in Psychology, which is a great US-based organization, but anyone can join, woman or man, and psychologist or not, they sponsored a book that I then edited called Bias in Psychiatric Diagnosis, where different people wrote chapters about the sexism in diagnosis and how it's created and how it's applied, the racism, the classism, the homophobia, the ageism. So it's really important to know that there are 3 myths that they have put out there, and that they have all of their books and medical journals and psychiatric journals and popular publications and getting people on the talk shows to perpetuate these 3 myths. And the 3 big myths about psychiatric diagnosis are: 1, that it's scientific. The second myth is that getting a psychiatric label will help alleviate your suffering. It almost never does. There's one exception, and I'm not sure how it works in other countries, but in the US and in Canada, there are certain kinds of services that children or adults cannot get unless they get a psychiatric label. So there are all sorts of horror stories about your kid can't come back to school unless they take their medication because they've gotten a psychiatric diagnosis. And then because they have a label, we will give them extra help or special consideration. Lots of stories like that, certainly for veterans in the US and in Canada. You can't get certain benefits or services if you don't agree to be called mentally ill. And one of the most, I think, insidious and alarming for me of the psychiatric categories in the DSM is post-traumatic stress disorder. Because, as you may know, that was created by some well-meaning people after the Vietnam War, when Vietnam vets' suffering was pretty much being ignored. And so they made a list of the kinds of suffering that they were seeing in these vets. And then they said, oh, we have a great idea. Let's see if we can get this in the next edition of the psychiatric manual, because they thought that would somehow make it seem more real. People would take it more seriously. And you can understand why they thought that was a good strategy. But the problem has become this, that you meet somebody, and I know this applies to people in the UK, to people wherever there's a military. You meet somebody who's been in the military, who's been exposed to war, or who was sexually assaulted by their sergeant. That's a trauma. That's upsetting. It's devastating. PTSD leads us to call those totally understandable human reactions to trauma a mental illness. And I always want to say to people who insist on using that term, if being devastated by war or rape is a mental illness, and what would be a healthy reaction? So I want to beg people, when you leave this conference, please don't use those terms, except under one condition, and that is if you can't change the system that requires you to use it in order to get help for people who are suffering, then go ahead and use it, but explain to the people who are labeled that they must know deep in their hearts that they are not mentally ill, that they are being deeply human in responding to something horrible that's happened to them. So that was the second myth then about psychiatric disorder, the myth that it's usually helpful. It rarely is. In fact, the third myth is that getting a psychiatric diagnosis doesn't cause any harm. Well, it causes enormous harm. As I said, it is the building block of everything bad that ever happens in the mental health system. So everything that you can think of, harm from drugs, harm from being restrained, harm from being court-ordered into treatment, being put in isolation, having custody of your children taken away from you on the grounds that you are mentally ill, losing every conceivable human right, and even death. These all start with getting a psychiatric label. Why death? Because many of those drugs have been proven, this really is good science, to increase the rates of suicide and homicide. So those are the three major myths about psychiatric diagnosis, and it's tragic that they are so widely believed because there is nobody providing regulation. Oh, and let me just say here, the American Psychiatric Association that creates and publishes the DSM and profits from it hugely is officially registered as a lobby group in the United States. Now, people have said to me, oh, but the APA publishes the DSM. The APA, those are helping professionals. Those are people who care about human suffering. And I have to say, well, some of their members may care, but as an entity, they are a lobby group, which means that by definition, they are concerned with increasing the power, territory, and financial gain of their members. So you have a lobby group it's the only game in town, except for the ICD, which, you know, the ICD and DSM authors are very proud of how hard they work to make sure that the psychiatric listings in the ICD fit really well in almost every instance with what's in the DSM. So this is alarming because there is no regulation. And so we thought, well, how do we go about getting regulation? Jim Gottstein, who created Psych Rights in the States, who's a fearless lawyer who's gone up against drug companies, he suggested that complaints be filed with the ethics department of the American Psychiatric Association. So I sent out a call for people who were willing to file a complaint. I said I would help them write them up. And that's what happened. Now, for whatever reason, I don't know, only women came forward bravely. And so I organized the filing of 9 ethics complaints, and in which we were basically saying each of these people was severely harmed, and it started with getting a diagnosis from the DSM. And if they had known that the DSM was not scientific and that getting any label would put them at significant risk, they would have known what questions to ask, and they might well have avoided a lot of harm and a lot of additional suffering. And a big section in those complaints, about 30 pages worth, included documentation very carefully of who in the APA and within the DSM Task Force knew or ought to have known that what they were doing wasn't scientific and that caused harm. And the answer was everybody. So we filed these complaints, and each complainant wrote a little section saying my story, saying, here's what was happening in my life at the time that I got a psychiatric label from the DSM. Here's the label, or here are the labels that I got. And here were the horrible consequences of getting that label. The complaints were filed. They refused to tell us who was going to review them. They refused to name the people who were on the ethics committee. We asked that they have these complaints reviewed by people outside of the APA because of the obvious conflict of interest, and they didn't even respond to that. And then they, after months of delay, they completely dismissed all of the complaints with no comment at all about the merits of the complaints and about the suffering described therein. And they gave two quote unquote grounds for dismissing them, both of which were patently absurd. Two little paragraphs. So I wrote back to them, and the only person whose name I knew was the head of the ethics committee. I think she's an administrator, not a psychiatrist. And I said, both of these grounds are false, and here's why. And please tell me how we go about appealing. And they said there was no appeal. So then a brilliant feminist attorney friend of mine, Wendy Murphy, said, I think you should file the complaints now with the Office of Civil Rights of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. And so we did that. Now, that was a bit different, because what we were saying was, in the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act has two sort of main provisions. One is, if you have a disability, but you're treated as though you don't, like if you have a wheelchair and they won't put in a ramp for you, that's discrimination. But the other provision of the ADA is, if you don't have a disability, but you're treated as though you do, that's discrimination. So 5 of these courageous complainants then filed with that US federal office. And they were saying things like, my mother died and I was grieving. And a psychiatrist diagnosed me with major depressive disorder, put me on a drug to which I had a bad reaction, put me on another drug, and so on, and eventually gave me electroshock. And it ruined my mind, ruined my life. So there were 5 very different stories about how it had all started with psychiatric diagnosis, with going through something that was a human experience. That why would you call it a mental illness and then treat it as though it were? And horrible consequences came about because of that. So these were people who should never have been diagnosed with a psychiatric disability, but were, and who suffered as a result. Now, the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Health and Human Services dismissed all of the complaints with no attention to the merits, and again, like the APA, with 2 very short descriptions of 2 grounds on which they were dismissing them, both of which were absurd and had been addressed within the complaints. I just felt like, did you not even read them? And so I again wrote a letter. I said, these grounds for dismissal are baseless. How do we go about appealing? And they said, there is no appeal. Now, why does any of this matter? It matters because since there is no oversight and there is no option for getting redress from harm, except you can try suing your individual therapist, very hard to win those cases. But about the people who started it all, the creators of the diagnostic manual, nobody's providing oversight. And now we have, through these complaints, we have a paper trail proving that not only is there no regulation, but also that the 2 entities, one a lobby group and one a government body, that by all rights ought to be the ones providing some regulation and oversight, have absolutely no interest in doing that. So it's up to us to do things to make it better. And that's why, we go to conferences and we talk about the horrible things that people have experienced. And I always worry that people will leave thinking, oh my God, it's worse than I thought. It didn't just happen to me, it's happening all over the place. These systems are so huge. What can we do about it? I guess nothing. And then you go home feeling horrible. And so whenever I talk about this, I make sure to talk about actions that people can take. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the people who've been harmed are the ones least likely to have the resources to fight against it. They're worn out physically. They have probably been damaged physically by electroshock or by drugs or some combination of the two. They are usually depleted of financial resources. They often have few sources of moral support or social support or even social contact, because once you're diagnosed, people tend to back away from you. So what I'm going to do now, I call, the subtitle is, this is a psychiatric diagnosis action think tank. And what I want to do in just the next few minutes, because I want to leave some time for your questions and comments, is run through very quickly a whole bunch of actions that anybody can take. And some of them take 10 seconds and no money. And some of them take more time, more effort, and a couple of them require some funding. But if you want to take notes, I hope you will. There will also be a link provided to a list of some of these. So I'm going to go through sort of in order of how much time and money they take. So the quickest two things you can do, and I can't give the links in this way because they're very long. But if you go to change.org, there are 2 petitions there, and you can sign them and help get them out. I created them years ago. I don't have a paid job. I don't have any staff. I don't have any resources. So I haven't really done the good social media thing of trying to get these out there widely, but you can do it. So one of them, if you go to change.org and do a search for boycott the DSM, a human rights issue. That's one that you can sign. The other one, I started going to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. many years ago, talking to legislative aides, and in a couple of cases to the actual legislators. Somebody like me usually doesn't get to talk to the actual legislators, and trying to get them to hold congressional hearings about psychiatric diagnosis. Now, I know that in the UK, the brilliant and wonderful James Davies and Luke Montague have done some work speaking to Parliament about problems in the mental health system. But you could ask for parliamentary hearings. You could start a petition in the UK to hold hearings, legislative hearings about psychiatric diagnosis, because nobody's ever done it. Let people who have been harmed by it come and talk about that. If people feel they've been helped by it, they got services for their kid from the school, or they got veterans benefits through getting a diagnosis, let them talk about that and start a national conversation broadly, not just at our conferences where we're preaching to the choir, but start a national and then a global conversation about what to do about this, how to prevent harm, how to get the truth out. So those are a couple of 10-second things you can do. Then therapists, if you're a therapist, or if you go see a therapist, or tell your family and friends, here's what should happen for any therapist who gives anybody any psychiatric label. And there are reasons that sometimes people do this. I won't go into that now, but in any case, any therapist who gives somebody a label should write on the page where they give the label. They should write in large letters, and this is described in the book Bias in Psychiatric Diagnosis. If you're not writing this down, if you want to find it, it's in the introductory chapter. They should write, the fact that this person has been given this label should not be taken to say anything, to reflect in any way on their ability to be a good parent, a good employee, a good citizen. And if anybody has any questions about this at any time in the future, please be sure and contact me at the following contact information. So that's another thing. It's very easy to do, and it's almost never done. How many therapists say to a person, I'm going to give you a label, and here's the label I'm choosing, and here's why I'm giving it to you, but don't think there's something wrong with you. You probably know that even the authors of the DSM, every time a new edition comes out, they try to find a good definition of mental disorder. And they always say, well, we couldn't. Nevertheless, here's this huge compendium of many hundreds of categories and subcategories of alleged mental disorders. So their comment that we couldn't even come up with a good definition for mental disorder overall kind of gets lost in the shuffle of these hundreds of disorders and the word statistical on the cover of the DSM. Next thing that you can do is go to a website I created, and I'm not good at websites, and so, but there's stuff I put on there when I can get time. It's called Psych Diagnosis, P-S-Y-C-H diagnosis.weebly, W-E-E-B-L-Y.com. And there's a lot of information on there. There are very short videos by some of the people who filed the complaints, telling their stories. And in some cases, actors who read the stories because the actual people who were the complainants were still too much at risk by going public with their stories. There is a list of references there. If you go to YouTube and do a search for the title, Call Me Crazy, and Paula Caplan, Caplan spelled with a C, you will see a play that I wrote. It's a comedy drama with music called Call Me Crazy. And there's a not very high quality video recording of a performance of it, but you can watch it. It's amusing, it's educational, and you can use it in your communities. If you contact me, I can send you the script. If you want to, people have had readings, people have gotten theater departments to do readings or performances, productions. It's very inexpensive to do, not a lot of props and costumes and that sort of thing. But it reveals a lot of truth. And if you can, because some of the scenes are so funny, people who go in there thinking, well, I'm not an expert and I'm not a mental health professional and I probably won't understand this. If you can get them laughing, then you tell them the truth and then they know they get it. So Call Me Crazy can be a useful tool. There is, people have said to me, well, do you think we should just throw out psychiatric diagnosis? And I know they mean that as a rhetorical question. And the answer is, yes, I do, actually. And what people then say is, well, what would you put in its place? And I said, well, at first I said, I don't know, but I know that there's so much harm that comes from psychiatric diagnosis that first we have to expose that harm, and then we can look for solutions. And then after years of hearing really caring therapists talk about how they use psychiatric diagnoses, I thought, oh, I know the solution. And there's a list of solutions on the Psych Diagnosis website. There's a whole section called Different Kinds of Solutions. But one of them is what I call the solution of radical honesty. And what that is goes like this. Caring, well-meaning therapists will say, somebody comes to me and they're suffering. And I listen to them and I think, well, I think I can help them in 8 sessions. So their insurance will cover, and I don't know how this works in the UK, but their insurance in the US or in Canada will cover 8 sessions if I give them a diagnosis, say, of adjustment disorder. And then the person comes to see them for 8 sessions and they're doing somewhat better, but they're not really okay yet. And so the therapist thinks, you know, I think they need some more sessions, and I need to make a living by seeing them. And so I'm gonna tell the insurance company that actually they have major depressive disorder, because then I can see them for 20 sessions and insurance will reimburse for it. So my radical honesty suggestion goes like this: that whoever the insurance is, if it's single payer, if it's the National Health Service, if it's private insurers, whoever the insurers are, will say to people, any of you who are licensed to give a psychiatric diagnosis, instead of doing that and playing this game that we know you're playing when you decide what label to use and when to change it and so on, instead of doing this game playing, what you will do is you write down what's the problem that the patient wants to work on and how are you approaching it, and then how many sessions do you think you'll need? And then, if that's coming to an end and you think they need more, write about what progress has been made and what more you think you can do with this person, and about how many more sessions you need. Because that's really what's happening, except nobody's saying that that's what's happening. We're just going through this fiction of the science of psychiatric diagnosis and how many sessions would be needed. Okay, another possibility is lawsuits. Oh, sorry, before I get to that one other quick one. For years, I've been talking to Amy Smith, who's a psychiatric survivor and a great activist in the US. She's a great graphic designer. And I've said, you know, when I go to see my gynecologist and I'm sitting in the waiting room, there's a brochure, and yeah, it's published by a drug company, and it's, you know, a multicolored brochure, and it says, do you need hormone replacement? And you read about it, and of course you're supposed to conclude that you do, because the drug company that paid for the brochure, that's what they sell. But it's there as though it's endorsed by the doctor I'm about to go in and see. A brochure, that's what we need. A multicolor brochure saying, briefly, I hate jargon, I hate technical language, just in the words I've been using with you today, that will say what you need to know about psychiatric diagnoses. So it would go over the 3 myths, it would cite in small print references where you can go and see that this is the case, this is all documented. Questions to ask your therapist, what you can ask the therapist to write on your chart if they're going to give you a diagnosis, what you can do to try to reduce the harm that might come to you from getting a diagnosis, and then a link to a website, which I already have, which I'll tell you about in a second, that has brief videos, more than 24 of them. Each one is somebody saying, without jargon, here is a way that without pathologizing people, I try to help them. Now, this came from a conference I organized about military veterans at Harvard Kennedy School some years ago. And I can send Joe that link if people want to have it, because it's a very long one. And it's everything that I had mentioned before: getting involved in the arts, community service, have listened to you, having legal assistance when you need that sort of thing, physical exercise. My understanding is that in the UK, physical exercise is the first line of treatment recommended for what gets called depression, for feeling bad. Right? Wonderful. You know what a recent Surgeon General in the US recommended as the first line of treatment? Electroshock. So thank you, UK. Okay, so I need to find $6,000 US to write up the brochure, have Amy design it, and get it printed. We'll put it online. The patients and prospective patients and their family members can download it for free. Therapists can put it in their waiting rooms. Activists can distribute them freely. And if anybody has any idea about where to find funding for that, please get in touch with me. So the last 2 things, the next to last thing is I want to make a film, a full-length documentary film about psychiatric diagnosis. Nobody's really done it. And I'm a filmmaker, and I've made some documentary films that have done well. And I'm just desperate to make a film about this. And we will be including interviews with survivors who are talking about their experiences and about what harmed them and what really did help them. But we think that the public deserves to know the truth about all of this, and a documentary film would be a great way to do it. But I need about $100,000 US, and so far I have $100 dollars. So anybody wants to help with that. Now, so the last thing I want to address is lawsuits, and I know we're getting low on time. So I will just tell you two things about lawsuits. Somebody needs to sue the APA, obviously. I have, in 1995, when They Say You're Crazy came out, one of the things I said in the book was, I think the only way to stop these people is through lawsuits. I have not found a single lawyer who is willing to take this on, except somebody who's with the Scientologists, and they're as dangerous to people who are suffering as some mental health professionals are. So I am trying to find, in the UK, it would have to be a barrister, I guess, who would take this on. And a lot of people in the survivors movements have said, oh, we should have a class action lawsuit because there are so many of us. And I don't know how it works in the UK, but in the US, if you try to get a bunch of people together and say we've all been damaged by the same source of harm, it can go all the way up to the US Supreme Court and get thrown out because you didn't define the class of people appropriately. So it's a huge waste of time. We need a test case of somebody who's been harmed by psychiatric diagnosis. And I've got lots of detail that I can go into if anybody can find a lawyer. At this point, I don't want to hear from any more survivors who will say, you can use me, because I already have hundreds of names, but I need a lawyer. And then if we can do a test case and get going on what will be a series of lawsuits, no doubt, that would be wonderful. And we won't be, on the advice of Wendy Murphy, my brilliant lawyer friend, we won't be asking for money. We will be asking for what are called equitable remedies. So things like the APA must keep a record and make it public of complaints filed with them about harm from diagnosis. They must set aside funding to redress the harm that's caused when people file these complaints. They must have symposia at their conventions that include survivors who have been harmed. They must look for ways to reduce the harm. They must have a black box warning on every copy of the DSM, every advertisement, and so on, saying the 3 myths. Do not believe that psychiatric diagnosis is scientific, or that it is harmless, or that it will be helpful in most cases. So, and I've got 7 or 8 different grounds for lawsuits that I won't go into because we want to stop and have some time for questions.